world.
A majority of the funds we're appealing for will support water and sanitation interventions, which have been identified by the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Committee and the Humanitarian Assessment Team as one of the most significant priorities.
The international community steps up support of those affected by storms in the Philippines and the hungry forgotten of Djibouti.
From our earlier estimations of having around 3,000 acute malnourished children being treated, and now we are at 5,000.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Hello and thanks again for your company this week. First to the Philippines, where international agencies have stepped up efforts to help thousands of people affected by a tropical storm and flash floods which hit the region last weekend. According to some reports, around 1,000 people have died since the storm struck the northern region, causing widespread flooding and landslides. The World Food Programme is one of several agencies responding to the emergency, as Jerry Adams reports.
The Philippine government is asking the World Food Programme to provide food assistance and other support to over 200,000 people, many of whom have no access to food and clean drinking water. While tens of thousands have secured shelter, WFP is working hard to reach the thousands who remain inaccessible. As far as health conditions are concerned, Tarek Jasarovich of the World Health Organization said preliminary reports for two cities, Iligan and Cagayan de Oro, show that major hospitals in the cities are still functioning. Health centers, however, are not doing as well.
In Cagayan de Oro, 12 health centers are not functional, and Iligan, 10 community health centers are not functioning right now.
The only public health threats so far following Tropical Storm Washi are injuries. But because of poor sanitation conditions, there is a risk that communicable diseases will occur. Again, Tarek Jasarovich.
WHO is going to send mosquito nets shortly to the centers where displaced persons are living together in order to prevent malaria outbreaks.
According to Marixie Mercado of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, 200,000 children have been affected by the floods, including 20,000 who are in evacuation centers. She says basic hygiene items such as soap are lacking.
Waste collection and disposal systems are poor, and people are defecating in the open because toilets have simply been damaged or destroyed.
UNICEF is appealing for $4.2 million to assist families affected by the storm in the next 3 to 6 months.
A majority of the funds we're appealing for will support water and sanitation interventions, which have been identified by the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Committee and the Humanitarian Assessment Team as one of the most significant priorities. Our assessments show that around 80% of water systems in the two most affected areas, this is Cagayan de Oro and Iligan cities, are not functional and will take weeks or months to repair.
UNICEF's Marixie Mercado.
Jerry Adams with that story. So to Africa, where patrols by peacekeepers have been stepped up in the troubled Jonglei state in South Sudan. It follows a renewed outbreak of inter-ethnic violence that led to the deaths of 40 people at the beginning of December. Rival tribes in the region are due to hold a peace conference in January in an attempt to stop the bloodletting, as Daniel Dickinson reports.
Indian peacekeepers on foot patrol in Jonglei, newly independent South Sudan's largest state. It was hoped that independence for South Sudan in July this year would provide a fresh start for the people of Jonglei, but tribal clashes continue. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands more displaced as the ethnic rivalry between the majority Luo Nua and Merle communities in Jonglei has intensified. In one incident in August, more than 600 people were killed in a single day. And in early December, armed men attacked a Luo Nua village, killing around 40 people. Heads of cattle, an important measure of wealth locally, were also stolen in that raid. Insecurity remains a huge challenge in South Sudan. The United Nations peacekeeping mission there, UNMISS, has responded to the insecurity by dispatching patrols to deter intercommunal violence. The UNMISS force commander is General Moses Obi.
UNMISS is putting every effort alongside with government to see that we manage the crisis. So we have a lot of patrols in many places, including Gorumuk, Piribo, UI. We've been patrolling the area of Bo. And today I'm here to see the soldiers and to see to how they are behaving. I mean, they are faring. and also to interact with the civil administration and other security agencies to encourage everybody to do their best to protect civilians.
It's not easy patrolling this remote part of South Sudan. The roads are bad and the distance is large. Ajus Gain is from the Merle tribe and lives in Gumaruk, where the latest attack took place.
I am worried now because of the expected attacks by Lu Nuer and Dinka Bor. When they carried out the last attack, they raided and took all our cattle and children. As a result of that, we lost everything which we depended on, and some even lost their children. Now we heard that they are on their way coming to attack us again. I now fear from what will happen this time. That is why we, particularly the youth, are vigilant to stay around and defend the elders and children.
Decades of civil war with the north of Sudan has led to a proliferation of arms across the south. Peace was eventually made between north and south. Now the UN mission is working with religious groups in South Sudan to organise an all-Yongle peace conference in January next year. The hope is that peace will also come to communities in Yongle State.
Daniel Dickinson there reporting on the continued violence in South Sudan. Often on this program, we take a look at the levels and changes in migration taking place around the world, and it's a phenomenon that appears to be on the increase. And with that comes a need to protect those who are seeking a better life. Bella Hovey is a specialist on world migration issues. He says there is a need for more countries of destination to ratify the International Convention on Migration, which protects people on the move. I asked him why this is so.
Currently, there are about 45 countries that have signed that convention, and most of them, if not all, are important countries of origin of migrants who would like to see their migrant workers protected abroad. But very few of the destination countries where they are currently living have signed up to that convention, and we would like to change that.
And what sort of things does the convention cover?
The convention is a very comprehensive document. It has two parts. One talks about the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, regardless of their status. And there's a second part which talks about additional rights of migrants in a regular situation. So essentially, it deals with issues such as access to education, to schooling, access to health in destination countries. It is about also the legal rights of migrants, and that is a comprehensive document that took a long time to negotiate, but once that is ratified and signed, that really lists all the rights of migrants and also their obligations.
Is there a typical reason why recipient countries would be reluctant to sign the agreement?
We actually think it is also in the interest of destination countries to sign that convention and to make sure that migrants are protected, fully protected. Irregular migration is a very big concern of destination countries and also of countries of origin. And when migrants are in an irregular situation, that means it's very difficult to protect their rights. It is very easy for them to be exploited by employers who are undercutting, for example, the salaries of those who are in an irregular situation, meaning greater competition for locals. Also, if migrants are in an irregular situation, maybe they contract diseases and they're not having access to health care. That is, in fact, dangerous for the host population. And the same goes for education, because an educated migrant is of more value to the host country than an uneducated migrant.
Which countries suffer the most difficulties when it comes to migration?
You can see that every country, and increasingly globally, countries are receiving migrants. It used to be that the traditional countries of immigration, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, were the main ones to receive migrants. They are still receiving the greatest number, and they have experiences going longer than 100 years to deal with migration, immigration, integration, etc. What you see more recently is that every country on the planet, almost, or pretty certainly, it has become a country of destination of migrants. So you see new countries of immigration, which used to be countries of emigration, have now to change their policies. They used to encourage the protection of their workers abroad, and now themselves they receive immigrants and have really to make sure that the immigrants in their own country are protected and contributing as much as possible to development. As the Secretary General has said very often, every country is now a country of origin, destination and transit.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
A world dominated by China's overwhelming economic power is being envisaged in a new book which studies how the balance of superpowers may look in the next 10 years. Entitled Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance, tells how China is expected to outpace the United States in economic growth and become the prevailing superpower. Duncan Wilson has been speaking to author Arvind Subramanian, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's asking how the predicted scenario for the next decade will play out.
The US has become really enfeebled in three different respects. One, growth over the next 10 years remains very weak, in part because debt levels are high. Second, of course, is the well-publicized fiscal problem that the US has. It has a looming entitlements problem and a medium-term fiscal problem, and the US has been unable to come to grips with that. But then there's also a third under-recognized problem, which is what I call the beleaguered middle class problem. That really relates to a series of related pathologies like median incomes have stagnated over the last 30 years. Inequality has been rising sharply, especially because people not at the top, but at the very, very top are getting a disproportionate share of the pie. Mobility declines. So the whole American dream of a good future for the middle class, for a wide cross-section of people, that's in trouble.
So that's about the United States' decline. So China, in your telling, becomes the new superpower. So how does that happen for them?
It's the differential in performance between China and the United States that actually facilitates the eclipse, which I'm talking about, which is China eclipsing the US as the major superpower. And China going forward, I project, will grow at about 6.5–7% a year. So its economy becomes bigger. As a result of that, its trade is also booming. And it continues to be a kind of net creditor to the rest of the world. And the US continues to be a net debtor. And by 2030, I claim we will have a world, certainly not a G20 or a G7, and not even a G2. I say we'll have a G1 with China as the number one because of this differential performance between the US and China over the next 20 years.
What are the drivers of growth there?
It's going to be what I call convergence, which is that poor countries have to catch up. And the way they catch up is by growing faster than rich countries. And the mechanism by which that happens, of course, is that if you're poor, you have a lot of investment opportunities. So capital flows into your country. And then you also learn how to do things, how to manage an economy. And so your productivity grows. So it's a combination of higher investment, productivity growth, and the fact, of course, that many of these poor countries have very rapidly growing labor force.
What can other nations learn from that Asian country's rapid growth?
The fact that it has a state which delivers some key economic functions in a way that few states around the world have been able to do. For example, if you were to contrast what the difference between China and, say, a typical African country is, they don't have states that can maintain law and order, that can provide the conditions for investment, that can deliver basic goods like, health, education, services, and infrastructure. The Chinese state, I think, has been just phenomenal in history. Plus a turn towards markets after Deng Xiaoping came to power. I think that combination has been fantastic for China.
Still with the International Monetary Fund, and the newly appointed IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde is visiting Africa for the first time since taking on the role. She believes creating new trading partnerships with Asian countries would best protect Africa from the financial turmoil in Europe. Lucy Maboto Fuda asked her about this.
I'm not coming to share best practices and to have expectations. I'm really going there to listen and to appreciate what is expected of us by the African governments, by the African people as well. Because it's a region of the world which is facing both huge challenges and huge opportunities.
Now, what is the economic outlook of Africa given the European crisis?
African countries generally have a strong partnership with European countries. A lot of the trade, for instance, between African countries has been historically with European countries. If I look at Niger, for instance, that I will be visiting, the lead trade partner of Niger is France. And many African countries have tight relationships with Europe. But the situation is evolving, and there is clearly a tendency now to trade regionally more and to also trade with Asian countries. This is a recent development which is good for African countries because it allows them to hedge their position and not be excessively at risk of what is happening in Europe, for instance.
And how can the fund help African countries cope with the impact of this crisis on their economies?
Well, as you know, the fund has some specific programs for low-income countries. We have a program that is the PRGT, which is Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which finances 29 African countries in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment to face the difficult circumstances that they have. And we are really very concerned about the spillover effects of the European crisis, and we want to make sure that we can make available concessional lendings and resources if and when needed and requested by the countries.
Now, let's talk about the long term a little bit. What are the long-term challenges for Africa?
The long-term challenges are also the long-term opportunities, depending on how you look at them. But clearly, it's going to be a question of creating inclusive growth that will generate jobs. Jobs is what is going to be most needed in African countries. When you look at the demographics of Africa, you're talking about 900 million inhabitants, half of which, roughly, are under the age of 20. And this young population is both the strength of Africa as well as its major challenge, because we all want our children to have jobs. So to that end, clearly African governments have the responsibility to create the environment where both the private sector and the public sector feels confident investing in African countries in order to create the job opportunities for the young people.
Prevent abuses and torture and end the culture of impunity. That's the message an independent expert has given to the government of Kyrgyzstan on Wednesday. Juan Mendez has just finished his visit to the Central Asian nation. He was allowed to visit detention facilities and speak to victims. He said ill treatment is widespread in the country and is often committed by security officials during interrogations to extract confessions. However, he told Elena Vapnichnaya there is political will to change the situation.
The police detains on suspicion and then tries quickly to get people to confess, or else to signify where to find additional evidence. And so the first 2 or 3 days, they are subjected to pretty brutal but more or less standard kind of practice, like beatings with sticks and batons, or a frequent testimony was the use of plastic bags over the head, and in some cases electricity.
And it looks like there is absolute impunity. The officials could not cite a single case of a guilty verdict against officials who were suspected of using torture, even when there was forensic evidence, and the lawyers do not seem to be much help either.
Impunity is very pervasive. Only this year they started at least submitting some cases to the courts, but some of them get terminated because the victims withdraw the complaint, and legislation is such that torture is a relatively lesser offense, and so if the victim doesn't press charges, nobody pursues them. So one of the urgent needs is for legislation here to reflect the seriousness of the crime and raise it to the level of a serious crime so that investigation and prosecution can be done ex officio.
Yeah, and I've heard that even lawyers who are mostly appointed by the authorities do not defend them so much, but they even advise them to sign the confessions.
Yeah, they have a system that they call duty lawyers, which is very interesting on paper in the sense that the Ministry of Justice pays fees for lawyers who take on representation of people who cannot pay their own lawyers. But in practice, what happens, and also the interesting thing is, again, the legislation contemplates that you have to have a lawyer before a statement is taken from you, which sounds very progressive. But in fact, what happens is that these kind of law firms, if you will, just come in as a mere formality. They never advise the defendant. They never tell them that they have a right to remain silent. They never object to questions posed by the investigator, and all they do is to tell them to sign.
Well, that's the thing. It looks like the new authorities and the chief prosecutors seem to have the political will to change the situation, and there are good laws and there are norms and decrees. But how do you change the culture where torture is a norm, where it's acceptable, which seems to be the case in Kyrgyzstan?
Well, I think you have to do several things. Unfortunately, you have to do them all simultaneously and in a coordinated fashion. But you have to attack the impunity question by initiating cases, investigations, and the Attorney General here, the Prosecutor General, a woman called Aida Stolianova, has begun that process. She's probably the only high-ranking authority that is taking this problem very seriously and is doing something about it. And I think the whole legal safeguards, especially the duty lawyers, is a good idea, but it has to be revamped. And then finally, I think the physical conditions of prisons are also very conducive to mistreatment. So they rapidly have to close down some of these dungeons and quickly revamp and refurbish some of the others.
I had the idea that you were appalled, basically, by some of the conditions that you saw in places of detention. Can you give any examples?
The so-called temporary detention facilities would be bad enough, but if they are dedicated, as the law says, for only 48 hours at a time, they are okay. But the problem is that in practice, there are people there who spend months, not only 48 hours. And these are cells without light or air. And these people are there all the time, except for a couple times a day when they're taken to the bathroom, and that's the only exercise they get.
You've come at the invitation of the government. It looks like you had pretty much access, except for a few quite serious cases. What was the reaction of the government to your conclusions and to what you've seen and your preliminary, let's say, recommendations?
I met with the president and with high-ranking officials of the parliament and several cabinet members, and I heard very encouraging signs from them. First, conscious of the problem. They don't hide it. They know that they have a serious problem with torture. That's not enough, certainly, but it's a good start.
Finally to Djibouti, where malnutrition is threatening the lives of thousands of children suffering from the drought that has hit the Horn of Africa region. According to UNICEF, there are as many as 19,000 children who are being treated for malnutrition at health centres in the country, and food prices are adding to the difficulties for parents to provide food for their children. UNICEF's representative in Djibouti is Youssefa Marato, who told Alpha Diallo that malnutrition started to get worse in Djibouti around mid-year.
From May 2011, we started seeing increased numbers of malnourished children coming to the health centers or being screened by the community activists. So from our earlier estimations of having around 3,000 acute malnourished children being treated, the figures kept increasing, and now we are at 5,000 malnourished children being treated of acute malnutrition. And we have around 14,000 children being treated on moderate malnutrition. So in total, we are treating now 19,000 children on acute and moderate malnutrition.
So, but in which area are you focusing more on what you are doing and how UNICEF is coping this humanitarian situation?
Our program is countrywide, and with the emergency situation, we tried to focus more in the affected areas. So right now, we find ourselves working in the most affected areas of the north, which is Dikil, Tajura and Obok, but also working in the peri-urban areas of Djibouti and other capital cities where you find people living in very precarious conditions because they don't have sanitation services, they don't have health services, and they don't have water.
You are describing a very concerning situation, but why Djibouti is a forgotten country in the Horn of Africa crisis? Why?
When the international community is thinking about the Horn of Africa, first of all, they are seeing the bigger population countries. Secondly, they are seeing countries with visible economic problems that they need immediate aid, they need immediate response. As for Djibouti, it tends to be left always like, okay, there is Djibouti also, but it's small, they can manage. In fact, as a matter of fact, we cannot manage. Djibouti cannot manage because apart from the drought crisis, there is poverty in Djibouti. And that's maybe which is not visible because nomads who live in the most vulnerable areas of the country are not visible. So when people come to Djibouti, when people refer to Djibouti, people refer to Djibouti town. That's true. More than 50% of the population of Djibouti live in Djibouti town, but there are people in the vulnerable areas of Dajura, Dikil, and Obok.
On this issue of poverty, food insecurity is likely to remain difficult in 2012. So for UNICEF, what's the worst case scenario for you?
The worst case scenario for us is that there is no rains this season, and not having rains this season, the number of vulnerable families will increase, and increasing the number of vulnerable families, of course, we will have more children, more malnourished children. The best case scenario is that at least the rains this season will come, and if we have the rains this season, I'm sure the populations who are living in the peri-urban areas of the capital cities will go back to their places of origin, and they will start their lives, and then we will be able to support them in strengthening their livelihood through the CAP 2012 that was just launched. But if it doesn't happen that way, then we will see ourselves still mobilizing resources to help provide water, to help provide, in case of UNICEF, provide nutritional products to manage malnutrition, which will see the caseloads increased.
Youssefa Morato in Djibouti, ending that report by Alpha Diallo. And that is The World for this week. If you want to learn more about the program or wish to make a contribution to the show, then please visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. From there you can also access our Facebook page and join the discussion on many of the topics raised in this program. The World is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet either on a mass or individual scale, and we hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch via www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I look forward to your company next time for the final program in the series this year. Until then, bye for now.